As you can clearly see, the thing that I support causes good to increase over time. Meanwhile, the thing that you support causes good to decrease over time. Therefore, the thing that I support is clearly good, and the thing that you support is clearly bad. Destroyed by the graph. In 1990, a group of independent researchers and the World Bank proposed to measure the world's poor using the standards of the poorest countries in the world. They examined national poverty lines from some of the poorest countries in the world and converted the lines to a common currency by using purchasing power parity, PPP, exchange rates. The PPP exchange rates are constructed to ensure that the same quantity of goods and services are priced equivalently across countries. Once converted into a common currency, they found that in 6 of these very poor countries, the value of the national poverty line was about $1 per day per person, and this formed the basis for the first $1 a day international poverty line. The World Bank later updated this poverty line to $1.25 per day, and then again to the $1.9 per day that we see in our graphs here. Since the specific graphs we're looking at were made, it was also updated yet again in 2022 to $2.15 per day. That they keep updating it, even though it's already adjusted for inflation, should maybe make us a bit suspicious of its usefulness. So this global poverty line was created by looking at the poverty lines of a small number of the world's poorest.
Why would that make you suspicious, aren't they? They're continuing to update it for inflation, right? That's why it keeps rising. So $1 a day in 1990 is like $2.15 a day now. But I mean, he's more right than wrong. I guess it's just like it just comes across as a bit extreme to be like, oh, this thing that's going up is good, and this thing that's bad is going down. And then, I mean, he hasn't answered the question. And, I'll give him a chance. I'm trying not to interrupt too often, but he hasn't answered the question, like, does he think that poverty is bad? I don't know.
It's quite clear from these figures alone that the international poverty line is just kind of a load of crap, and I'm hardly the only one who thinks this. There are many economists who've done thorough, deep dissections of it who've come to similar conclusions, though they're too nice to say it in the harsh terms that I use. One of these economists is the same Mikhail Motsos, whose data was used to create this very graph. He wrote, "Only by coincidence the international poverty line would be consistently representative of a welfare-specific type of absolute poverty in any specific country or the world as a whole." So, if the World Bank's extreme poverty line actually does somehow manage to accurately reflect the extreme poverty rate anywhere in the world, it would be nothing but a coincidence, because the standard that they chose is arbitrary, the quality of the initial data that they use is highly questionable, and the way in which it's then used to extrapolate figures for different time periods and countries.
So you get the critique, but you don't know why you would look at the methodology and just accept the terms without looking at how it's used as a heuristic tool. Does not mean the heuristic tool is not useful. Yeah, I mean, I think the issue is like how triumphalist people are in the use of these graphs, right? I think the problem is they've gone beyond, like if it was just a poverty line for researchers to use, which is what it should have been, and for like institutions like the World Bank, that'd be one thing, but you get people, I mean, he's quoting people on like Twitter or whatever, but people like Bill Gates, for instance, who use it quite like directly in like a political argument, as a political argument for liberalism. I think the guy was using on Twitter, right? And a political argument for like the current social and economic system. I think that's why it's so sus. Like if it, like you could, because you could, I mean, the international poverty line is I think he's done a good job of critiquing it overall, to be honest. If the international poverty line were just confined to like the halls of academia, and it would be like any other measure. You can critique a lot of different measures in this kind of way, and a lot of statistics are just kind of crap in a way when you get down to like the nitty gritty, but then so's every other type of evidence.
And there's also other angles of attack against these graphs, then just pointing out that they're largely based on just sort of making stuff up and saying, trust me, bro. For one, in those that go back far enough, the trend of a rapid rise in the number of people no longer living in extreme poverty begins around 1950. This hardly correlates with the dominance of global capitalism. It's actually right around the time where the Soviet Union began to reach its greatest heights, and where China, the world's most populous country, had just completed a communist revolution. And even the world's richest capitalist countries of the time, such as the USA and the nations of Western Europe, had much more statist, less so-called free market economies back then, a fact that I've explored in depth in one of my videos responding to Johnny Harris. Motsos actually acknowledges this in a part of his paper which is usually ignored, saying that, by the World Bank's metric, Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union experienced the most drastic reduction in extreme poverty in recorded history. This is highly inconvenient for those who use these graphs to argue for the economic status quo of today. For two, this graph also correlates with the period of mass decolonization that occurred after World War II. Over the following decades, dozens upon dozens of countries went from being colonized to being independent, something that, basic logic would dictate, would probably result in a rise in living conditions and incomes there. So even if we were to make the error of taking these graphs at face value, it could hardly be said that the spread of global free market capitalism is the only possible explanation for what they show. And given that such an argument is in the first place little more than pointing out a supposed correlation, one could then just as easily argue in response that the real cause was some other thing which also happens to correlate with what the graph shows, as I just did. Lastly, given that the international poverty line of $1.9 per...
Yeah, but there is still a part of the graph that he's missing, right? Which is like after the fall of the Soviet Union and after the after the transition of China into being a sort of more of a capitalist country. There is a very big decline there. Like, yeah, okay, it's not when the decline starts, but that's the steepest decline. And if you look at specific countries, I do think the decline in China, for instance, was like after they abandoned communism. I mean, let's state the obvious: the Great Leap Forward wasn't great for poverty, was it? Right? Although I suppose if people die, they're not included in the poverty count. So, I mean, don't get me wrong. The point is well taken, right? You've got to investigate these things more thoroughly than people are doing, right? I do agree on that, but I don't think it makes too much sense to say that the the decline is from the Soviet Union and China during their communist years, and then kind of ignore the bit where they aren't communist and ignore that decline is steeper. Unless he just thinks it's all caused by completely different things. I mean, maybe he does. But I don't think that's defensible either.
Given how that contradicts the narrative of many of the people who employ these graphs, it would be very misleading for them to take credit for the reduction in people living on less than $7.4 per day when most of that happened in China. All of that makes things look a lot less rosy than the World Bank's initial graph does, doesn't it? So one might ask, why would the World Bank do this? What might have motivated them to create, and then so pervasively spread, this clearly bogus global poverty line? I'm leaving this bit for last so that no one can just lazily accuse me of ad hominem, but they'll do it anyway. It's because the World Bank is hardly some politically neutral institution. Despite the world part of its name, it was created by the Western Bloc in 1944 to serve their own interests, and has duly done so ever since. Since the 1970s and 1980s, one of the pinnacles of said interests has been the spreading of so-called structural adjustments, where predatory loans from the bank to desperate or coerced target nations come with the condition that they fundamentally change the very structure of their economies and their laws that regulate it, to open it up, as the euphemism usually goes. The data on the effects of this has since shown that such structural adjustments very suspiciously result in a substantial redistribution of wealth from the rich to the poor, and from poor countries to rich countries. Surely, it's all just a coincidence though. So the World Bank thus has a vested interest in spreading this idea that such policies have actually been massively successful, hence their extreme poverty metric and all of the graphs that result from it. In summary, everyone who cites the $1.9 a day international poverty line should parachute into a random country with nothing more than $1.90 a day to spend and put their beliefs into practice. That'd be the best reality TV show ever. Now let's move on to something else.
Okay, so I think he was on relatively strong footing with the actual critique of the data, because it's so flawed. But this link to structural adjustment programs needs a bit more, right? I mean, where's the actual link? He goes, oh, that's a coincidence. Like, this is like how conspiracy theorists reason, right? It's like, oh, look at that. Maybe they want their structural adjustment programs. And I think the crucial thing that ignores is that the World Bank and IMF, they kind of moved away from their structural adjustment programs after they failed, right? And a lot of this poverty reduction, it's not in the period, not necessarily in the period, the 70s and 80s especially, right? It's in the period after they stopped pursuing such extreme policies. And China bucked the trend. I mean, I don't know, right? I just don't think there's enough here, because he's citing a book written by David Harvey about the history of neoliberalism, and he's citing these statistics, but he's not like linking them together, right? Like, oh, that's suspicious. And by the way, structural adjustment programs were and are bad, and the poverty data is kind of bad, but I'm just not sure about the link between the two of them.
Before the era of the Song dynasty, lived at a standard of living that could be proxied by a highly controversial modern metric of $450 international dollars. As for what he did to arrive at the rest of his estimates for the remaining 2,000 years in this graph, Deng recounts that Madison just sort of arbitrarily decided that the Chinese GDP per capita remained nearly exactly the same, stagnant at this made-up number of 450 from the year 1 all the way to the year 1000. He then explains that this completely flies in the face of what many of the most well-regarded historians of China have said about how its economy actually fluctuated quite a bit during this period. The next
Oh God, it's so bad, isn't it? It really is. Like, just when this type of economist tries to do history, and they're just like, yeah, China, like, That's what happened in China for 500 years because I said so. It is really, really bad. I mean, it's kind of funny, but it's not, because these are the kind of estimates that like the World Bank will use, and they have quite a lot of influence. And also like just the general projection of like GDP back throughout history from before a time when it was relevant. Like if you don't have a market economy, then GDP just is not that relevant. I mean, arguably its relevance is limited today, right? But at least you can understand why someone would use it.
This part really has to be directly quoted in full because it's something. Madison's speculations for rates of growth are drawn from a restricted range of reading from secondary sources in Chinese history and then transposed into numerical abstractions. They deserve to be quoted in his own words. I assume growth of per capita income under the Song was substantial, i.e., it grew by about a third, but was slower in pace than Europe achieved in the proto-capitalist period 1400 to 1820. I assume that per capita income peaked in the Song when there is good reason to believe Europe had fallen substantially below Chinese levels. Exclamation mark. A temporary setback occurred under the Yuan, but over the long run in the Ming and Qing dynasties, per capita performance was roughly stable. This bold summary, covering centuries of Chinese economic history, could hardly become consensual among experts for a field that is distinguished by the most impressive historiographical tradition for research and debate for any Asian country. In summary, Angus Madison, for whom the Madison Project is named, quite literally picked a random number to use as a base in the year 1 AD, then just estimated changes in Chinese GDP per capita year on year over a nearly 2,000-year period by just sort of jotting down some notes on the vibes that he got from a couple of Chinese history books, and then he made up numbers based on them. No actual data was used at all. Literally none. Effectively, we're talking about a guy who just made stuff up at random, and the stuff that he made up is taken deadly seriously by a lot of supposed experts. The truth is that to even call this an estimate is insulting to estimates. If your ayahuasca gnome blurted out a random series of numbers at you, it'd be just as rigorous and likely to reflect actual reality as these figures. Deng fittingly concludes his paper with a scathing indictment of the very idea of such historical GDP calculations. Concepts such as GDP per capita do not travel, either through time or across the polities and economies of Eurasia. And he's right. GDP was invented relatively recently and is designed to measure economic activity in modern capitalist economies. It's hardly so simple to apply it to societies from many hundreds or even thousands of years ago that had economies that were really not even remotely overall anything like those in much of the world today, and especially not given the total lack of anything resembling adequate data. And yet, we live in a world where Madison's often very blatantly just plain made-up figures are cited by a whole lot of supposedly serious people, including many historians and academic economists, and then accepted by other supposedly serious people with
So this is like the need for decolonization, right? I mean, aside from just economics and economists, the fact that like these Western economists think that they can just like read a couple of books and then make stuff up in this way is just the biggest indicator that we need like decolonization of these ideas. And it's just like, why don't you, like at a very basic level, it doesn't have to be anything fancy, why don't you just fucking talk to somebody who actually knows what they're talking about? Is really embarrassing. And yeah, I can't, it's you find this stuff still in like textbooks and like modern textbooks, even the updated ones. People will just use it in research because it's the Madison Project is like the fallback for people if they just need something. So yeah, I mean, fucking hell, he's very right here.
With scarcely even a question asked. It says something quite negative about the economics profession, that this sort of thing is taken seriously within it. The Madison Project figures can be pretty decent for a limited selection of countries, going back maybe 100 or 150 years or so, if used with a good understanding of how they were constructed and their limitations. But the further you go back beyond that, the closer that you're getting into just plain made-up territory. Because as what we just went over in both of these last two examples shows, past a certain point, they can't be based on anything more than guesswork, and they even might just be outright made up. These are things that you should always...
Yeah, I'm pausing him a lot, but I do actually think that GDP, you know, there needs to be a threshold, a cutoff, beyond which you just don't display the data. So if a country or a time period doesn't have data that is good enough quality for you to be able to make a statement about the GDP or about the inflation or whatever of that country, the unemployment or anything, you know, it doesn't have to be just economics, like health outcomes. If you don't have it, then you don't put it in the data set. You don't put it on a graph. You cut the graph off when the data begins being useful. You don't display anything for the countries that don't have it. And I think, by the way, the World Bank's poverty calculator, I think it actually, there are quite a few countries for which it does say you're not, it just won't display the data. But then when you aggregate it, it acts like it's the whole world. And that's the problem. You've got to have excluding certain countries.
Look out for in economic metrics that go a ways back in time. You need to ask questions like, okay, so how exactly do you pertain to have so precisely measured the consumption rate of rabbits in Guatemala in 1350? If it seems far-fetched, it just might be.
Quite funny.
So we've gone over two metrics that claim to measure things that can actually be measured somewhat accurately, poverty and production, but that definitely do not measure them accurately. This is a post on Twitter, now known as X, by Matt Darling, a self-proclaimed neoliberal. He has a couple of economics degrees and a history of working for think tanks that advocate for so-called neoliberal economic policies. He often discusses economics on his X account, usually arguing for his preferred policies by posting exactly the same sorts of graphs that this video is about. In this instance, Darling was using this graph right here to dispute the assertion that Ronald Reagan's presidential term from 1981 onwards correlated with the decline and stagnation of real hourly wages paid to US workers, despite the fact that many other graphs clearly show that this was indeed the case. Here's another chance for you to pause the video and take a longer look at the graph that we're going to be going over here for yourself, and see if, especially given what I just explained about real wages, you can spot some things about it that could be skewing the data in favor of Darling's assertion.
Empanada.
Okay, so first things first. This is not at all a graph of real hourly wages. It's a graph of real yearly income. The distinction might sound like splitting hairs, but it's really not, because hourly wages and overall yearly income are not at all the same thing. Yearly income includes all income, regardless of its source, and does not account for things like how many hours were worked. Thus, that the graph shows a rise in income over time is not at all indicative of hourly pay actually increasing, as this could be explained by many other factors, such as people working more hours, or gaining more income from investments. So in response to one data point, real wages, Darling posted a graph that measures an entirely different data point, real income. The fact that this income is per adult, rather than only including people who are actively working, is another layer in how it's very misleading. Measures of real wages can, by their very nature, only include those who are actively working and being paid for it. Meanwhile, income per adult includes, well, every adult, from the rich.
Wait, okay, so I mean, technical point is taken, but wait a second. Is it the case that the original... What was the original thing that he was responding to?
A self-proclaimed liberal economic policies. He often discusses economics on his X account, usually arguing for his preferred policies by posting exactly the same sorts of graphs that this video is about. In this instance, Darling was using this graph right here to dispute the assertion that Ronald Reagan's presidential term from 1981 onwards correlated with the decline and stagnation of real hourly wages paid to US workers, despite the fact that...
But wait, what? Okay, so we haven't actually seen the original claim. Was it definitely about real wages? Because I want to see what he was responding to. Because it does seem that, okay, like, yeah, I agree that real wages have sort of stagnated since the 80s, right? In median real wages in the US as well as the UK. But the original claim is from a suspended account. Is it? What? Can we look at it? Do you know what it said? Because, I mean, it's complicated, right? Like, I do agree with this. You shouldn't conflate the two. But just bear in mind that income is actually important, right? So if workers or people are receiving other benefits that are increasing their standard of living and making up for the relative stagnation in wages. And one thing which, I mean, maybe he'll address this, but one thing is healthcare. So let's
go and take a longer look at the graph that we're going to be going over. Doing the real hourly indicative of gains, an entirely different data point, is another layer in how it's very misleading. Measures of real wages can, by their very nature, only include those who are actively working and being paid for it. Meanwhile, income per adult includes, well, every adult, from the richest to the poorest, wage worker or not. This means that the graph is also affected by yet more outside factors, such as an increase in the labor market participation rate. One clear way in which this skews the graph is, for example, the fact that more women joined the workforce from 1980 onwards, causing them to go from having no personal income at all to actually having one. Lastly, and this is something...
Okay, but then, see, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Isn't that a good thing, right? Or can you very plausibly argue that's a good thing, the entry of women into the workforce and them receiving more income? Like, I don't know. Unless, let's just take him as narrowly making the point that the two measures are different. But, I mean, it all goes back to what was this originally in response to? Because if we're trying to get at material living standards as opposed to hourly wages, then I think the income metric may be just as relevant, right? And not necessarily the best or the only metric you could use. You should probably look at both, right?
So, in response to an assertion made regarding real hourly wages per worker, our friend referred to a graph that measures something that is very different: average real yearly income per adult. And there is absolutely no chance that a guy like this with a couple of economics degrees and a history of working for various think tanks didn't know exactly what he was doing there. It was an intentional attempt to manipulate people by using an entirely different metric, which he handpicked, because it's skewed in just the right way to make his own politics look better.
I mean, I'd like to show this to Matt, because I have spoken to Matt on this channel before, and he really doesn't seem like the type of guy who would intentionally try to deceive people. Like, I would like to hear his explanation for why he used real factor income. Like, I'm sure there's a good one, and I mean, I've already given you a couple of reasons like why you would use it. Again, depends on the deleted claim, which is quite irritating. I mean, I don't know. I'm not saying that Bad Empanada is lying, but what I mean is that the wording, since it's been deleted, the wording is very important, right? The exact wording, because we're being quite meticulous and pedantic here.
On the idea that most people would not care to, or would be unable to spot, the problems with what he did, and would just take it at face value. And honestly, he was right about that, because there was scarcely even a question asked about this from his audience. He even quite boldly includes a link in his post to the source of this graph, realtimeinequality.org. Let's check it out. Straight away on the front page, there is an interactive graph with a bunch of options. Let's change it to average real income, the measure that he used. You can immediately see here that by default, the website shows us something that is quite different to the graph that Darling posted. And that's because he actually went to the sidebar here and turned off some of the options that are shown by default, which split up the graph by different income brackets. He then posted more or less this graph right here, which includes absolutely every adult in the USA in the same metric.
Well, yeah, he used like the whole data set, right? He chose the total one. He just did the one for everybody, not like, I don't know.
Looks great, right? Well, if we go back and turn back on some of the settings that the graph includes by default, we can see that it actually includes a measure of what the bottom 50% of Americans, the majority, made over this time period. And it shows, even using this rather flawed metric, that their income was, in fact, largely stagnant for most of this period, just like the figures for real wages also were. In 2022, it
1 second. Is this? I mean, this is a really bad
made over this time period, and it shows even using this.
I mean, I think he's right, but it's because the other scales are so much bigger. It's really difficult to see what's changing in this one.
Other flawed metric that their income was, in fact, largely stagnant for most of this period, just like the figures for real wages also were. In 2022, it shows that the bottom 50% of Americans.
Right. I'm sorry. Hello everybody, I just wanted to give you a non-confusing overview of what I'm talking about here. So I just thought it would be nice if Bad Empanada had unticked these and then shown us the average real income zoomed in so that you can see some of the fluctuations and you can see that there actually is a rise, then a fall again. I mean, it's bigger at the end of the period than it is at the beginning, and to be fair, he does say this, but it just would have been nice for him to zoom in. But the broader point I'm making here, so this is average real income and factor income. There are really loads of different ways of looking at income data, and I don't think it's particularly helpful to accuse people of lying when there are just so many different ways to slice and dice this. So for instance, one thing that he leaves out completely is disposable income. Right, so this is after all taxes and cash transfers. Now look at this. Now you can see that, as you would expect, under Reagan, this does not do too well, right? But there is this gradual rise, over the period and up to today, and then it goes mad during the pandemic because of all the pandemic taxes and transfers. So probably best to ignore that bit. But, you're talking 2019, it's like 24.5K, up from like 17K in... 1976. So there are some positive trends overall in some measures of the resources available to people. This doesn't mean that hourly real wages for the average person didn't stagnate. I think that Bad Empanada proves that, right? But it just comes down to this question of what are we interested in here? And I think we're interested in a wide range of indicators.
Many economists are very much in denial about the fact that their field is a social science, with all the same limitations that every other social science has on the strength of the conclusions that they are able to make. Attempting to quantify human behavior is certainly a worthy pursuit, but it's one that comes with many, many problems, some of which are sometimes simply insurmountable. Good economists tend to be very happy to acknowledge their limitations and to critique those in their field who don't. But there are still many others out there who like to massively overstate the significance and reliability of their conclusions and don't seem to mind at all when others subsequently use their flawed work to mislead in the public sphere. And in some cases, they even actively do that last part themselves. All of this is especially fundamentally pronounced because economics is the bedrock of modern politics. So there is a ton of political capital to be gained by presenting data from experts that to most people, who really probably don't care that much to look further into it, would appear to validate a certain political position. The result of this is the exact sorts of misleading metrics, graphs, and practices that we've gone over here. It's kind of shocking how simple it can be to dismantle this sort of thing when you do look further into it, with none of the education that many of the experts who made and peddled them have. You can do it too. You don't need any sort of special knowledge of mathematics or statistics. You just need to know the meanings of certain terms like real, average, and median, and be willing to stop and think critically about what it is you're looking at, to ask the same sort of questions that you've seen me ask here, and to look deeper into how these metrics were made to get answers to them. Then you can judge for yourself as to whether you think that what you're looking at is a decent enough measure of what it claims to be depicting, a load of made up bullshit, or something in between. And a really crazily high amount of the time, they'll turn out to involve practices that can scarcely be considered much better than just making numbers up, or they might even just straight up be made up, or they'll be presented in a clearly manipulative way, contradicted by other sources, that is very easy to spot once you know what you're looking for. And hopefully, this video has equipped you with what you need to do all of that. So that's the end of the video. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more, and maybe even...
So, yeah, I mean, look, he doesn't go in for the respectability politics BS, so a lot of libs don't like him. Yeah, but I mean, like, come on, like, I mean, he's just outright accusing somebody of lying with, like, not really a very strong basis. I don't know if that's, like, respectability or if it's just itself a lie. I think the... So clearly, right? Okay, so GDP in fucking China and Rome, oh my God, it's just nonsense. I completely agree with him there. I thought this was a really good dive and it explained like quite a lot of things really well. The poverty line, certainly the way that it's used, I'm not sure about the $2.15 a day line. I'm not sure about really having one line for the whole world. I think anyway, whatever the line is, I think that's pretty ridiculous. So fair enough. Economic freedom index, possibly even more ridiculous than GDP in the Roman Empire. But I do worry because he's then pivoted, and I kind of expected him to do this. I actually thought he was going to talk about the vibe session, which this is adjacent to, but I think there's a danger of just insisting that anybody who is like in the economist tribe, or who is actually a practicing economist, or is like to the right of you, anyone who is like saying that maybe something improved or was good, just insisting that they're manipulating the data. And I think when you get to something like real wages versus like factor income, there's no right measure. There's no complete measure. I mean, this is the difficult thing about statistics in social science, right? And he has showed us that. But I think he's kind of used it to argue that he's right, as opposed to like the situation is complex. And yeah, I don't think that it really concerns me, because one thing that you might miss with all of this is that clearly, right, GDP has increased by a lot, and I think by all reasonable metrics, like materially in terms of consumption or production, our standard of living is much higher than it has ever been in the past. Like, there's no reason to believe anything otherwise, right? And the same goes for like the decline in poverty in recent years, and it does show up in other metrics. It does show up in like malnutrition. It does show up in like health outcomes, infant mortality. I don't think there's nothing there. And similarly, the story about real wages, right? It's really complicated because you've got all these things about healthcare, hourly versus like annual wages, different sources of income, which he was going into. And I think just to insist that all the like economists are lying to you and actually like it all favors leftist narratives, I feel like that's what we're in danger of doing here. Because you could almost make a similar video that just argued from the other side and was like, oh well, look, they're lying because they're not using all the sources of income, they're only using hourly wages, they're missing out healthcare, they're not acknowledging that actually, you know, there has been progress in poverty and other outcomes, they're not acknowledging that GDP has clearly gone up since the start of the Industrial Revolution and we're in a historically unprecedented situation. You know what I mean? You can weave that narrative. So again, I think most of the details of this video are good, but he does what I thought he would do, which is basically try and weave an extreme and kind of almost conspiratorial narrative out of it, which I just don't think is warranted, because anyone who has actually dealt with statistics just knows that there are just decisions that you make when you're compiling a data set, when you're measuring something, when you're running analysis, right? There are decisions you have to make, and there's often no right decision. And different decisions lead to different conclusions. And we've all got our biases, right? So, yeah, I don't know. I think it's... the name of the video, I know this is clickbait, right? Like, so, okay, fine. Lying with statistics, how economists just make stuff up. Like, like, you know, I mean, you can see what he's trying to do here, right? I just think is too much. And again, I'd like to speak to Matt to see what he had to say about this, because you don't have to go to these extremes. And like, when I made my Steven Pinker video, which covers a lot of the same ground, I deliberately avoided doing that. And yeah, like, top comment, my ideology is correct because this graph made by a neutral organization, brackets, please don't look into who is funding it, said so. Bourgeois economics is price astrology. I mean, that's kind of funny. But like, you know, how to be an economist. Think about the shape of the graph you want. Use crap methodology and a start date you have zero data for. 3. Extrapolate wildly to produce desired shape. Profit. Yeah. Anyway, like, it's fine. It's fine. It was interesting. And I actually wasn't aware of that paper that he cites. The one that he cites quite heavily at the beginning. The guy's name began with M. Is it because it's in Spanish? Oh, bloody... Oh, Moatsos. No. Behind the Veil of Dollars. Interesting, yeah. So yeah, I mean, look, I don't like these poverty graphs, and there's definitely a triumphalist narrative that you get from the likes of Steven Pinker, but I don't want to go into like the opposite narrative that like any statistic that vaguely indicates that things are improving is necessarily a lie, right? Come on. Yeah, I mean, fine. The title's fine, but you know, it's not like the title's one thing and then he's like just not doing that at all and he's just being really nuanced, right? It's like the title's one thing and then the video is that same thing.